Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the redneck, and you bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to convince you to do it too. And a reminder on this program, when we say go green, we mean that in a multiple of ways. The two most important ways from my way of thinking is, first and most importantly, deep ecology, not merely conservationism, not merely environmentalism, but a recognition of the interconnectedness of all of life. And that whether you come at that understanding through hard science or through an eco spiritual worldview, or like me, you say those are both true, the reality is that all of life is interconnected. And whatever we do to the web of life, we ultimately do to ourselves. The second way I mean go green is Green Party. I am a proud and unapologetic member of the Green Party. We don't turn this program into nothing but Green Party rah rah, but we are clear and unequivocal in our belief that the two-party system is part of the problem, that the neoliberals who control the Democratic Party and the corporatists who control the Republican Party are basically in agreement on empire, on capitalism, on how the world order is supposed to operate. So, with that in mind, it is my distinct pleasure to be bringing back to the program Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is, and I have to own it, a personal friend of mine, but more importantly, she is a journalist of high order. She's the author of Prejudicial, a Black America and the Presidents, which was published in 2020. She is the executive director and senior columnist at the Black Agenda Report, which she co-founded in 2006 with Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon. She can be found on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog and at patreon.com/Margaret Kimberly. And now we can add to that esteemed bio an expert who testified before the United Nations Security Council. Margaret, welcome back to Redneck Gone Green.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you again.
Margaret, I was telling you before we kicked underway that it's not every day that an anti-imperialist has an opportunity to provide testimony directly to the United Nations Security Council. So I'd love you to just like how the heck did that happen, lady?
Well, well, I have to thank Randy Credico. He's the individual I have to thank. Randy has this interesting life. He was a stand-up comedian who then became an political activist. He was a Green Party candidate for mayor of New York City, podcaster. But in recent years, he's been very much concerned with the plight of Julian Assange, and that's how I came to know him. He's hosted several programs advocating for Julian Assange, a journalist, a publisher who languishes in jail because he reveals the secrets that the state doesn't want us to know. And that is how I came to know Randy for the past few years. And he asked me if I felt comfortable talking about Ukraine. And I said, well, yes, of course. And he said that we might have this opportunity for me to be a briefer before the Security Council, people who are considered civil society representatives, journalists, as in my case, or leaders of organizations, have an opportunity to speak to Security Council members on specific issues. The issue on May 20th, when I spoke, was threats to world security, threats to international peace, and the discussion was Ukraine, which is a huge threat to peace, mostly because of the United States, actually all because of the United States and its allies. And I spent about 10 minutes talking about briefly the history of this conflict, how the United States is the driver of this continued proxy war in Ukraine, which does not have to go on, in which the Biden administration and the states of the collective West, as they are calling themselves, cannot achieve what it is they want to achieve, which is to dominate Russia and use this nation as a weapon against Russia. It only hurts that country. And also, they're not going to hurt Russia as they, I believe, fantasize about doing.
So, Margaret, and folks, if you're watching and or listening, know that you can go to our Substack, conveniently named Redneck Gone Green, and we'll make sure to post the entire video of Margaret's testimony before the United Nations Security Council, as well as a transcript. But we're going to actually ask Jack Rabbit, hey, Jack, would you play that very first clip? Because I think that the way it begins is really powerful. Hit it, Jack.
I now give the floor to Ms. Margaret Kimberly.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you all for this opportunity to address the Security Council and to provide a briefing on the issue of peace as it relates to Ukraine and its connections with people in this country and all over the world. As a journalist, executive editor of Black Agenda Report, and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition, and as a citizen of the United States, the nation taking a lead role in continuing the crisis, I'm eager to speak to this issue. As of now, the U.S. has allocated nearly $175 billion for the Ukrainian war effort and to support the workings of Ukraine's civilian government.
Margaret, thank you for stopping there, Jack, because when I first saw this, I almost fell out of my chair. $175 billion?
Yes, that's correct. It's there is consistency in from various sources with that number. It's a huge amount of money over the last 3 or 4 fiscal years. The U.S. has gone all in, supporting Ukraine, obviously militarily, but not just militarily. Essentially, now it's the U.S. that is funding Ukraine's government. Ukraine doesn't have its own money. So all of the goods and services that Ukraine provides for its people are actually provided by us, the people of the United States. There's also humanitarian aid. There's domestic expenditures for Ukraine, and of course, weapons. There were peace talks in the very beginning, and we can argue about whether Russia should have started what it calls its special military operation. But Turkey was brokering peace talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine in March and April of 2022. And the U.S. scuttled the talks, told the Ukrainians they should not make a deal for peace, that the U.S. would give them all the weapons that they needed. U.S. and NATO nations would give them all the weapons they needed, and they could defeat the Russians, get Russia out of Ukrainian territory. That has not happened. 2 years later, Russia is still in Ukraine and has about 20% of Ukraine's territory is now controlled by Russia. So
And Margaret, I'm glad that you brought up Turkey. And before the war actually broke out, almost nobody that I know actually knows that there was like it. Those were not just casual conversations. It's my understanding that there was an opportunity to stop this before it even began.
there were opportunities to stop it before it began. Russia spent several years asking for a security agreement. It goes back to 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. The U.S. chose sides with the right-wing forces, kicked out the elected president. There was an agreement the following year, the Minsk Accords, and the U.S. And European, France and Germany, I believe it was, were supposed to work with Russia. They were supposed to defend language rights for the Russian-speaking population. Um, This was approved unanimously by the Security Council. That was the Obama administration. It went nowhere because they didn't want it to go anywhere.
And so
And
that's the point, Margaret. They didn't want it to go anywhere because you also, a little later in this testimony, give a scathing indictment to both the Democratic and Republican parties as parties of empire. And again, I want to let you speak. And I'll be honest, I want to actually show the clip of you again testifying before the United Nations Security Council, and then we'll deconstruct a little bit about that. Jet, hit us up with clip number 2.
Project Ukraine, as it is called, is a bipartisan effort, with both Republicans and Democrats supporting the continued infusion of huge sums of money to the defense industry, the military-industrial complex, and to dubious projects in Ukraine itself. This funding is not just spent on the military, but is literally supplying many domestic government functions within that country. Most Americans are unaware, for example, that small businesses in Ukraine are being supported with their public funds, with at least $25 billion in non-military aid being spent. Money for weapons continues, thanks to consensus among the political class, while needy people here are being removed from the Medicaid program, which pays for health care for low-income people, as well as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Students take on thousands of dollars in debt to attend universities. The same administration, which is committed to spending money on weapons, has never presented a plan to help the estimated 500,000 people in the U.S. who are unhoused. There are constant calls to cut or end these programs altogether, but the funding stream for war remains untouched. Democracy itself is in crisis because of these endless conflicts.
So, Margaret, to me, I think that it is another example that whether a Democrat or a Republican is in the White House, whether the Democrats or Republicans control Congress, empire as foreign policy always is the rule of the day.
oh, it definitely is. We have seen, you'll see a handful of Republicans, a handful of Democrats who who say they oppose this continued war funding. But by and large, there is consensus between the two parties. And I think it's funny. This is a presidential election year, and we're always told that, well, now, as in the post-Trump era, or perhaps pre-Trump era, who knows, we're told democracy itself is on the ballot. And of course, if you vote for Joe Biden, you're for democracy. If you vote for Trump, you're not. But we can't have a democracy. How do we claim to have a democracy when anyone who wants to end this continued funding of a proxy war is excluded from the system? When the leadership of both parties, they are on board together. And you don't have to believe me, they say it. So in this last tranche of funding, it was money for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, so they could start a similar proxy war with China, presumably. What did they say? Chuck Schumer, leader of the Democrats, says of Mitch McConnell, leader of the Republicans, "I want to thank my colleague Mitch McConnell." Same thing in the House, Hakeem Jeffries. "I want to thank Mike Johnson and the traditional conservatives," which meant what? I'm not too sure, but they thank each other. They patted themselves on the back. And even those Republicans who wanted to end funding, they ended up being iced out too, and ended up having their marching orders and said, no, 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 forget that. You're going to back this. Trump himself, at first he was like, I don't want to keep funding Ukraine. Well, they got his mind right. And the next thing you know, Mike Johnson too, the House Speaker, he was considered a joke. He was considered someone not to take seriously. All of the sudden, he goes along. The corporate media starts calling him, CNN called it a Churchill moment. I mean, it was something really bizarre. So we see at the top, we see consensus. And so how can you claim to have a democracy when, and most people want negotiations of some
And
kind.
Margaret, when you say most people, the
Yeah.
reports I've seen are over 70%.
60%, 70%. That's a huge difference. Even people who say they back Ukraine or support Ukraine, they still want talks. They don't want war. They don't want all their money spent on this. But you wouldn't know that because in Congress, anyone who says anything different doesn't have a voice. The so-called progressives, they wrote a letter to Biden a year ago saying there should be peace talks. They didn't stand by the letter for 24 hours. They withdrew the letter and denounced themselves the next day. So we see a situation where the ruling class, we'll just use the word, the ruling class, the 1%, the oligarchs say, you're going to spend this money on the military industrial complex, and everybody goes along with it. The corporate media go along with it. They don't allow anyone who has a different narrative to be seen or heard, and all of this, and it's not just this issue we're talking about Ukraine, but we could say this about many other issues as well. It calls into question this constant refrain that we have a democracy that needs to be protected. Well, that's in the past tense now because we see the duopoly coming together more often than not when it comes to imperialism, when it comes to capitalism, and this is just one example.
And Margaret, I'm really grateful that you literally went through and talked about the fact that we have 500,000 unhoused people in the U.S. Oh, and by the way, there are depending on which data you look at, there are either 4 or 5 empty homes for every single unhoused person, right? So the ratio is 4 or 5 to 1. So the problem isn't even a housing inventory. The problem is capitalism, right? The problem is imperialism. The problem is that there is a bipartisan consensus for the predatory class that says this is how society is going to be operating. This is how the global economy is going to be operating. And you call out the corporate media and the propaganda machine in no uncertain terms. So once again, Jack, hit it. Let's hear Margaret Kimberly's testimony before the United Nations Security Council.
This corruption requires a steady stream of indoctrination and propaganda to keep the U.S. population from asking questions or actively opposing the war. I suppose that is why Secretary of State Antony Blinken thought it wise to perform with the Ukrainian band on his last visit to Kiev. Not only that, but neither the secretary nor his handlers were aware that the song he performed, "Rockin' in the Free World," is a lament about poverty and hopelessness in a supposedly free world, which isn't truly free. The administration is so divorced from reality, they thought it wise for Secretary Blinken to play this song as men are rounded up to be cannon fodder.
Well, I was speaking of several things there. First of all, the war is not going Ukraine's way. After this endless stream of money, endless stream of weapons, this consensus among the NATO and EU states, 2 years later, Ukraine's losing to Russia, just to cut to the chase. And so now there's panic. So Secretary of State Blinken went to Kiev recently, and for reasons known only to himself, thought it would be smart to perform with a Ukrainian band in a cafe, in a bar or something. And he's an amateur guitarist, as he says in his Twitter profile. But at any rate, he plays this song "Rockin' in the Free World,"
which is Neil Young, like a noted leftist anti-war activist.
I know.
It would be funny if it was a Saturday Night Live skit. I mean, it's just.
This will never be a Saturday Night Live skit, because doing so would mean skewering the people at the top who are Democrats. So it should be, but it won't be. And I also, the clip showed me talking briefly about the fact that Ukraine is short of men because so many young men have been killed the last 2 years. They are literally, anyone who wants to find this can just look it up, do an internet search. They are dragging men off the streets, literally, and forcing them into the army, giving them a couple weeks of training and sending them to the front where they're being killed. Now, the average age of their military is men in their 40s. I mean, that tells you the young men are dead. And this last fund allocation was dependent on Ukraine forcing more men to come back to Ukraine. Remember, everybody loved Ukraine 2 years ago, right? So there's several million Ukrainians in other European nations, some in the US, some in Canada, and they're being told they have to go back to Ukraine. So, for example, if they want to renew a passport, they have to go back to Ukraine, where they're going to be snatched up into the military. So at this moment, and they made a deal, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's easy to make fun of because he's such a buffoon, but he's no different from the rest of his colleagues. He demanded that the Ukrainians snatch up as many men as possible. That's how dirty this deal is. And that's what made Blinken's this performance, that's what made it all the more disgusting to me, that he, the author, one of the authors of this horrible plan, would go there and think he was being amusing. I don't know what he thought. I have no idea who advised him to do this at this juncture. But at this moment, when there is panic, and at this moment when they are suggesting, Victoria Nuland, who was formerly in the State Department, has now and retired. We thought we were rid of her. No, she's back saying we need to give Ukraine permission to strike into Russia. The NATO Secretary General is doing the same thing. This is very, very dangerous. We're talking about World War III, and that is not an exaggeration. Why? Because the U.S. has scuttled all of the treaties, all of the nuclear weapons treaties over the past 20 years. Democrats, Republicans, those treaties are now meaningless. And the U.S. is suggesting that Ukraine attack Russia directly. So in their desperation, and these are not smart people. Can I just say this? We're not talking about smart people. We're talking about people who have a fantasy of U.S. domination, a fantasy that they cannot fulfill. And if they try to, they put the whole world at risk. And I suppose, and in their desperation, they would think that there was something clever about Antony Blinken singing in a rock band in Kiev.
Folks, you're watching and or listening to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. We're talking with Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. She is also the executive director and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report, which she co-founded with Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon, two towering figures of the progressive leftist movement in the United States. She's also active with Black Alliance Report. Before we go back to Margaret, I want to remind you that if you are listening to me on Spotify, if you or any other place where you get your podcast, if you are watching this on Rumble or YouTube or Facebook, however you're getting this information, I ask you to please like, subscribe. I know everybody says that, and you know why they do? Because that's the only way we can break out of the algorithm so that ordinary people can have conversations like this. This is unsanctioned conversation. This is the kind of conversation and political analysis that the corporate media does not want us to hear. And that's why I'm asking you to subscribe to our Substack. We've got 4,000 and growing. I want you to please join and subscribe either on YouTube or Rumble. So every week that we come to you, you can hear this kind of conversation. And with that, I'm going to bring Margaret back into the conversation with an invitation to Jack, because you explain about how the propaganda machine really operates. And again, I thought that was a very powerful bit of testimony.
Yeah, it's there's this unholy alliance with corporate media and the ruling class and the state. Um, And you mentioned something that you said you had not heard before. Something very important. You were talking about the peace talks. There is information that I think people would be shocked and angry if they knew there were opportunities for this to never have happened. That it could still end. That their money could be spent elsewhere. That uh, the Biden administration is accelerating this danger. So yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's very dangerous to have such an uninformed public. You have to really search. You have to be inclined and be interested in these subjects in order to find out information that if we had real journalism, everyone would know.
And instead of real journalism, what we get is the ongoing propaganda machine. And then, in light of even all of that, again, like this 10 minutes was power packed, Margaret. You also made a statement about the ability for even with that 175 billion, even with all of these resources, you make a prediction about this conflict. That again, I want to let you. Jack, could you play this clip because I want Margaret's words before the United Nations Security Council. I want our audience to hear it.
According to President Zelensky, he's working with the U.S. and other NATO nations on a 10-year plan to provide weapons. Joe Biden can only serve for a maximum of 4.5 more years, meaning that he wants to make a commitment that a future president cannot change. In so doing, he invalidates the concerns of voters in this country and of the people who are supposed to represent them. As a citizen of the United States, I'm shocked by the lengths this country will go to in order to pursue a dangerous plan that's doomed to fail.
So, Margaret, doomed to fail. Like, you have some context for that. Again, because we're friends, I had a chance to talk to you a little bit about this, but I want you to lay out why, even with all this money, this miraculous saber rattling, it's not just saber rattling, the actual ammunition's going in is doomed to fail. Lay that out for us.
Well, what they want is to make Russia subservient to the West. And that isn't going to happen. They want to be able to control Russia's energy sector, its oil and its gas. And they cannot do it. Russia isn't going to stand for it. Russia is strong militarily. Russia has an alliance with China. Most of the world is on Russia's side. We're always told, Putin's isolated. That's one of their, stump speech lines. Well, no, most of the planet, they act as though the U.S. and Canada and the EU are the world, and they're not. So you have most of the world not wanting this escalation. There's of course, a range of opinion, but the last thing most of humanity wants, well, most states in the world want, is for this conflict to be accelerated the way that it is. So they can't beat Russia in a war. Russia is a military power. Russia's a nuclear power. China's a nuclear power. And as I said before, I'm hoping that's you can get someone as a guest. I'm going to make that suggestion, someone more well-versed in the issue of nuclear proliferation. But these treaties are dead. You have these two nations with a lot of nukes pointed at each other and no negotiations, no relationship, nothing standing in the way of Armageddon. You have a country, Russia, that's not going to allow itself to be pushed around. They cannot make Russia a vassal state. It's not going to happen. One of the reasons Russia is winning this war is that it has more manufacturing capacity than the US or any of the European countries do. So they can make artillery, they can make tanks, they can replace their weaponry. And that is not true of the collective West. They literally cannot do what it is they set out to do. Biden, in his infinite wisdom, said they were going to sanction Russian oil and they would turn the ruble to rubble. Well, that has not happened. Russia's economy is actually doing better now than it was 2 years ago, and it's startling to me that the president could be so uninformed. He and his top foreign policy team, they really believe that Russia only has oil and has its economy doesn't do anything else. That's not true. They've been protecting themselves from sanctions. They've been protecting their manufacturing sector, something the US stopped doing decades ago. They cannot do what it is they want to do. It is impossible. And in trying to do it, they risk a much wider war with nuclear nations.
And that's what really gets me. I really can't even wrap my heads around the recklessness that's associated with this war. I mean, it's look, there. All you have to do is do any amount of research, and I remember looking it up on. I think it's called Global Firepower. There's a website that actually tracks the military capacity. And yes, the United States is first, but closely behind. Number 2 is Russia. Number 3, closely behind, is China. Like, this is a no-win situation, right? And this idea that somehow the fantasy that the war hawks, again, and I want to be clear, not every Democrat is a war hawk, not every Republican is a war hawk, but the cutting edge of those folks, right? The bipartisan war hawk agenda has a fantasy that somehow the U.S. fights and wins a world war and comes out on top. And it's just not, like, it is devoid of any reality, Margaret. Like, that will not, cannot happen. A nuclear war might happen, but a conventional war where the U.S. somehow comes out on top is a fantasy.
Oh, and it's a very dangerous fantasy too. We have people who, what's the expression? They get high on their own supply. They really believe this stuff. They believe that Russia doesn't have an economy and all it has is oil and they could turn the ruble to rubble. They really believe that. And 2 years later, after they have failed to do everything they thought they were going to do, they thought they were going to peel Russia away from China. Now the two countries are closer than ever. Xi Jinping said we're better than allies. I don't know how you're better than an ally, but the two countries are very, very close. Why? To protect themselves from the West. So they brought Russia and China closer together. They've not destroyed Russia's economy. They can't take Russian oil off the market. Everything they said they could do, they have failed to do. But they cannot admit defeat. And I want to say something else about corporate media and propaganda. We're not given any information about Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. We're told they're authoritarians. We're told they're adversaries, but we are not told that both countries, and invariably when I say this, somebody will say, you think they're good? You think they're nice people? No, world leaders are not nice people. So never mind, forget that silly question. But they do want to cooperate. They do. China has presented a peace plan. It is possible for these nations to talk. And which is the opposite of what we're told, that they'll never talk and they don't want to negotiate and they can't be trusted. Well, they're no less trustworthy than the United States is. So there can be diplomacy. It does not have to be this way. And that's true of Ukraine. It's true in Gaza with Israel. It's true when there's trying to instigate something with China using Taiwan as a new Ukraine. Countries can talk. Wars can end with negotiations. A war doesn't have to end because there are more dead bodies on one side than on another. So we keep being told that the most sensible thing to negotiate, to make deals, if you will, is something that can't happen. It's something that can happen, and it is the only solution. It's the only solution to talk to other countries and to cooperate with them.
And I gotta say, like, I forget who it was. It's talked about all the time, and I think it's really worth saying it on this program. And that is, working class people, the non-owning class, the precariat these days of every country have far more in common with one another than they do with their own leaders. And that's true in Russia, in the US, in China, in Pakistan, in Israel. Like, you can go down the list. Working class people have more in common. That's why the refrain, no war but class war, is the one that I'm interested in. Like, because we have a world to win, Margaret, like literally the world that we could be living in now if we democratized technology, if we democratized the like all of the things that are available. There is so much wealth and abundance now, but instead wealth, power, and decision making is being hoarded like crack cocaine by a couple of lunatics and at the top of the pyramid in every one of these nation states.
Oh, absolutely. We are. That's what we're seeing. It's. I'm old enough to have seen different times. I'm old enough to remember Nixon going to China, to remember when the idea of talking to other nations was not dismissed out of hand and scorned the way it is. But this is capitalism. This is, some say it's the end stage. I don't know if that's, I don't know. I think we need to change that phrase, but this is capitalism doing what we can expect it to do,
And
to end democracy, to hoard resources, to make people, impoverish people all over the world. This is what capitalism does. And the United States is the leader in all of these things that harm so many people's lives here. And I touched on the needs that are not met in this country, that are dismissed, that are not meant. Joe Biden has Biden ever given a speech on people who are homeless? No, he hasn't. And it's an issue that cities and states are wrestling with, and there is no discussion of it at the top because
in
those
fact,
people don't exist
In
to
fact,
them.
in the last presidential election, I tracked. I didn't. I
Mhm.
I did the research and found somebody who had tracked how many times in the last three presidential debates houselessness or lack of health care. I mean, it's astonishing. If you take a look at the issues that people actually care about, and it's
Mhm.
like if the research is quite easy to find, right? Ordinary people are concerned about the climate crisis. They're concerned about healthcare. They're concerned about being able to provide for themselves and their children housing. And those issues are simply not talked about by either Democrats or Republicans. It's just off the table, Margaret.
It is. It means we're off the table. We're not on the agenda at all. And it's a funny thing, David. I was just thinking how all of the issues you mentioned, we're told those are radical beliefs. It's radical to want to have health care for people not to go broke because they get sick, for people to who work to be too poor to afford to have a roof over their head. These are things people want taken care of, except we're told that nobody's interested in that except you and your five little, radical friends. Um,
But the
but it,
polling data shows otherwise, right?
oh,
Like literally,
absolutely, of course it
it's
does. I
listen,
it's
Margaret.
just it's maddening.
It is. No, it's
Maddening.
it's very frustrating, but I love that's part of the reason I love getting on this program and talking to people like you is because it validates like, no, I'm not crazy. Like, in fact, most people, many people, again, there's going to be disputes around the margin, but most people want peace. Most
Yes.
people, right? Like the overwhelming majority of people want an end to not only the war in Ukraine, but the genocide in Gaza. Listen, we're coming to the end of the program, Margaret. So I want to go back to your testimony because you end with an appeal to an issue that has not gotten much attention in the corporate media, and I want to give again you an opportunity to explain it a little bit. But before, let's set it up with you providing testimony and an appeal directly to the United Nations Security Council.
Lastly, I would make a plea to the United Nations to use its power to investigate a catastrophic event that is tied to the Ukraine conflict. On September 26, 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed in an explosion which also sent 15 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, thus contributing to global warming. Investigations have been closed without conclusion, and at least one internationally known investigative journalist has provided evidence of U.S. involvement. Sadly, no one in a position to investigate in this country has demanded that. It is imperative that the United Nations undertake an independent investigation of its own. This is only possible if fantasies about domination are finally and firmly rejected. Doing so would free nations to be honest with one another, to struggle over issues, but to resolve them without death or expenditures of money that are better used for human needs. I thank you all profusely for this opportunity and for the work of the Security Council in upholding the United Nations Charter on behalf of the people of the world. Thank you very much.
So, Margaret, the Nord Stream pipeline, again, it was a horrific environmental just disaster. But what I remember was that the Danish government did an investigation. So, educate me and our listener viewers on what really happened.
Well, I'll go back a little. Russia has ample supplies of gas, which they sold to European countries. So there were several pipelines from Russia, mostly to going through the Baltics to Germany. The U.S. always hated this. When Chancellor Olaf Scholz first came to office, he was in Washington, and Biden said at a news conference that they were going to stop Nord Stream. He said it. We'll find a way to stop it. Victoria Nuland said before congressional testimony, I'm not sad it ended up on the bottom of the sea, basically telling the world when it blew up in September of 2022, I believed, and most people who watched this at all, believed that the U.S. had done this. They wanted to sever the relationship between European countries and Russia by destroying this pipeline. Well, last year, Seymour Hersh, investigative journalist, the man who broke the story of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, Pulitzer Prize winner, former New York Times correspondent, et cetera, wrote a 5,000-page article on his Substack giving what he called evidence that the U.S. had, in fact, blown up the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, they sort of investigated, but then they said, oh, well, we can't figure out who did this. No one, and this is the degree of collusion, nobody demanded an investigation, not a Democrat, not a Republican. The New York Times has never, or Washington Post have never even acknowledged that there is evidence showing this to be true. The United Nations needs to be the entity to investigate. I doubt that they will be, but I decided to say it anyway. This was an environmental disaster. It was an economic disaster for the Europeans themselves. The U.S. is so hell-bent on trying to dominate Russia. They have demanded from their so-called allies, which are really vassal states, that they slit their own throats in effect and spend money on what? Liquefied natural gas from the U.S., fracked gas, which is horrible for the environment, which is horrible for their economies, but it's something that has been ignored. And that's why I thought it was important to mention it.
And again, thank you for that, because Seymour Hersh actually lays out lays out the case that America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. He is he at least makes it draws a conclusion, and then he lays it out.
Yes, and the response was it was kind of comical. If it hadn't been so serious, it would be funny. First, they said it was 4 Ukrainians in a boat, and there was a woman doctor, and so then they changed that story, and they said, "Oh, it was some Ukrainians or other." Okay, so what have Ukrainians found out? I mean, it's ludicrous There was something very funny. Shortly after that story broke, they invited Chancellor Schultz to the White House, and it was very odd. He didn't have an entourage. There was no press conference. They invited him, and they got his mind right and told him to shut up. To shut up about Nord Stream, and so he did. The U.S. I am confident in saying that the U.S. was responsible, but it's not enough for conjecture. It's not enough for investigative journalists. An international body has to look into this. And that has to be the United Nations. Of course, the U.S. won't admit that it did it, and even the successor administration will defend this one. But I think it's important for people to know the lengths that the U.S. has gone to try to dominate Russia and to hurt its own so-called allies in the process.
Margaret Kimberly, thank you so very much. It's always a pleasure to have you here on Redneck Gone Green. You always bring such clear, unflinching analysis. Again, I want to encourage listeners, viewers of Redneck Gone Green to make sure that you add Black Agenda Report to your media consumption. It's one of the few places that you're going to hear the unapologetically Black radical tradition brought to you, and the lens by which both U.S. U.S. domestic policy and global issues are discussed. So I want to thank you again, Margaret Kimberly, for joining us. Thanks for all you do. I want to thank Jack Rabbit, our executive producer, and I want to thank you, the listener or viewer of Redneck Gone Green. Keep on keeping on.